Okay, let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining our presentation. I'm Pooja, the UW Recycling Waste Diversion Assistant, and I'm a senior majoring in environmental studies at the University of Washington. This presentation is hosted by UW Recycling. Our department provides innovative recycling, composting, and waste reduction solutions with unmatched passion for the health of our campus and our planet. In celebration of International Compost Awareness Week, we are chatting with Susan Thoman from the Compost Manufacturing Alliance about her experiences in industrial composting. Please remain on mute for the duration of the presentation. You may use the chat function to send the co-host name Q&A, any direct questions or comments or ideas you have throughout the presentation, and we will have an opportunity to address them after the presentation. This discussion is being recorded and we plan to make the recording available on our Facebook page after the event. Before we start the presentation, I want to give a brief land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land that touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands with the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Now to introduce our speaker, Susan Thoman has over 25 years of management experience within the solid waste and sustainability fields. Susan served on the Cedar Grove composting senior management team for 12 years, where she pioneered the development of working models to create collaboration between solid waste systems and the food service value chain. Susan is a former board member of the U.S. Composting Council and the Washington State Recycling Foundation. In January 2017, she and several partners formed a private industry group, the Compost Manufacturing Alliance, to broaden the vision and scope of compostable products testing across North America. Thank you so much, and take it away, Susan.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here today, and I want to give a shout out to the University of Washington and the many times I've been able to support and be part of sustainability events, and I've seen the leadership and the program grow there over many years. So it's great to be here today and sit with champions like yourself. So thank you for the opportunity, and it's been a privilege to put this together. So yes, the Compost Manufacturing Alliance is homegrown right here in the state of Washington. It did come out of my experience working at Cedar Grove for a number of years. Just a little bit of a preview on CMA. So specifically structurally what CMA is it's a partnership between 7 compost industry pioneers. I'm the only non-facility owner in the partnership. All the other partners own one, if not multiple facilities. They're all industrial or what's known as commercial composting businesses. They own at least 20 major composting, yard waste, food waste facilities. Some of them own biosolids facilities as well. They process over probably closer to 3 million tons of material a year. And our primary reason for coming together was to work on field validating disintegration of compostables across varying technologies, because what we do in Seattle, what Cedar Grove's facility does versus what another facility in another part of the country does differ. So we've taken that on as a way to align compostables with the processes they go into. At the end of the day, the goal is to make sure compost manufacturing is sustainable by minimizing the costs, additional costs and challenges of contamination in compost streams, and to actually work business to business with the supply chain to ensure that we've got programs that collaborate and, get us all to the place we want to go, which is really zero waste. A little bit about process technologies. So again, CMA started so we could start aligning with different processes, but when you're talking about an industrial composting system, the first type of system is a windrow system. This is probably the closest one to your home composting system in that you really just need a space. You need to get your C to N, your carbons to nitrogens in the right balance for your recipe. You grind it up, you put it out on a piece of land, and then you turn it periodically, just like you would at home. To create good compost, you want to aerate it and get that, those microbes going in the compost pile during the duration of composting. So windrow is one system and the most prevalent system in the United States that composters are using for processing yard waste, food waste. An in-vessel system just means an enclosed system. So this can either be a building that you put your composting system in, or in this case, the picture we have here is a gore cover. It's a membrane laminate cover that goes over the pile, and it acts as a sort of like a biosphere over that material, but it's a covered system, and that's where the term in-vessel comes in. Aerated static pile systems. A lot of folks are going from windrow systems to aerated static pile systems. That's because they are trying to add a little bit more control over the aeration. So if you're mechanically or manually turning it every 2 or 3 days and you want to have it just sit static, there are systems designed with certain aeration systems, either in piping or structures within the piles that give that aeration automatically. Mass bed systems are really shorter piles with a lot of aeration, and we don't do a lot of testing in those yet, but we plan to. And then finally, tunnel technology is used quite a bit for, it's also in vessel, but it's a tunnel, and biosolids and other materials are often processed in those. We have those in our system, but we have not yet really started testing in those. But the top 3, we have done a lot of testing and put over 2,000 samples through the system since we started in 2017. Just so you know a little bit about who our partners are, A1 Organics is out of Denver. They have a modified windrow. Cedar Grove is a partner here in the greater Seattle area. New Earth is down in Texas, San Antonio and Katy, Texas. Olympic Organics is out here. We're over on the Kitsap Peninsula. They have an ASP system. St. Louis Composting owns about 10 facilities between Missouri and Illinois. They do a lot of windrow composting, and We Care Organics is mostly the Eastern Seaboard, and they run a number of their own facilities as well as municipal facilities out in the East. So that's a little bit about who CMA is, but I always like to talk about how do composting programs start so you understand sort of what it takes to actually be in the business. And as we all know, policies really set the roadmap for composting to initiate in certain jurisdictions. One of the groups I co-chair at the U.S. Composting Council is a group called Target Organics. And Target Organics is working to create more information that will knock down barriers to building infrastructure. But many of the programs that you see across the country, especially here in Washington State, were all policy driven. So once those policies are set, then processors, haulers, those companies and groups come together either on a bid basis to answer, the opportunity to do the processing for a municipality or a jurisdiction. And then again, you also need the generators. You need to know you have feedstock and volume coming in to justify the investment in a composting system and a program, which are generally long-term contracts and that span a number of years because it is such a high investment. You need to have that return on your investment over a period of time. So what is the business model for compost manufacturing, which is something I work on a lot because I'm always trying to look at how do we add value to the compost manufacturing process, or how do we bring value back? So the first thing compost facilities do is they have to source compostable feedstocks. Just like any factory, you want premium inbound materials to create a premium product on the outbound. So whether that's a contract for yard waste, food waste, or going to a big stadium and saying we want all your peanut shells, they have to find the source of all those materials to come into their factory to create the product that they want to create on the end. The other thing I like to give a shout out to municipalities, cities, counties that create these programs and inspire these programs through policies, as well as the composters investing in the technology, is to remember they're adding value to negative value material. So if that material was shipping 200 miles away to a landfill, there's tons of economic costs to move it there. There's also the environmental costs of moving it completely out of your jurisdiction to a place where it actually goes into a landfill, where if the methane isn't captured, you're actually creating greenhouse gases now. So they're adding value to a negative value material. And again, those municipal or hollow contracts are necessary for the collection of that material, again, over many periods of years. And then you have to have a great deal of investment in land, process, people, education. There's a lot of compost produced in our area. You have to have sales plans and markets. And So it can be a very expensive business all the way around. And so we need to do everything we can to ensure we're not adding expenses or creating expenses or taking away revenue from programs where they count on all those pieces to remain sustainable as a business. The more we bring into compost facilities, the more volume grows. So when people compost, we always like to encourage them to always use compost in their gardens because that's the end of the whole process that we really need to also remember. By the way, right now I'm hearing there's tons of gardening going on. There's lots of great programs locally. Cedar Grove has a contactless bag delivery program that apparently is just very popular. So it's really fun to see. I mean, it's kind of hard. People are home right now, but they're gardening and growing vegetables. So I guess that's the upside of all this. And we're moving a lot of compost right now, which is great for our industry. So we talk about composting and we talk about the business model for that and how do we bring all that together when we're talking about compostables. So the supply chain is where a lot of compostable products are made, and composters and programs that promote publicly collected food scraps will always have some element where we have to deal with the packaging that comes with them. So as you all know, there's lab standards and certifications that tell us that that material meets, you know, certain standards for biodegrading to biomass and water, that it doesn't have metals in it, there's no phytotoxicity, and those are the lab standards, the ASTM standards, the BPI certification, that's what they do. On the other end of things are the compost facilities receiving them. And so CMA was really designed sort of as 0.20 in the process. And that started with Cedar Grove a number of years ago, where a lot of those products that were compostable or had met all those qualifying standards in the lab, you know, they weren't disintegrating within the active composting cycle at the facility. So what we're trying to do at CMA is to inspire collaboration between the supply chain and the facility receiving those materials, because we all meet in the bin. That's what I call the convergence zone. So if we're not creating one system together, we're operating in different systems. And like, you know, many of us have learned is that when you operate in different systems and you don't have the benefit of each other's knowledge or don't understand your goal and our goal, then we're really, you know, it sets us all up to, you know, have gaps in the system that create problems and add costs to everything, which we don't want. So CMA has really tried to inspire this working relationship through our model. And why is that so important? Because compost is the universal wonder mulch. We have lots of compost that's made in our marketplace. And for every application it would do environmental good for, we would be out of compost because you can just use it for so many things that have environmental benefits. Obviously at home right now, people are top dressing their landscapes. So here's you know, a good example of taking compost to top dress with. A lot of folks like bark and mulch and things like that, which is great. They're great for water suppression and weed suppression and water retention. They don't actually feed nutrients in the soil. So we say use compost as your mulch because you're going to be feeding the soil. It's dark usually and it doesn't fade out in the sun. And if you really like your bark and you really want more weed suppression, at least put a compost layer below your bark or mulch so that you're going to feed the soil before you put that mulch on top. You know, I always tell people, you know, it's sort of, we have the privilege of doing all this great composting in our schools, at the university, at home. You know, there's a lot of cities that envy us for what we're able to do here. And again, the city of Seattle, King County, all the leadership they've shown in starting these programs and the composters that stepped up and invested in this. But there's kids, second generation kids now that have never not composted their lunch scraps. So isn't it great that we get to bring that material that they composted back to the school garden? And by the way, schools don't have a lot of money for topsoil. So if you want to do a donation to your local school, buy them a load of topsoil for their garden. That would be a great gift. They can grow great food from their program. But we get to, you know, close that loop up by bringing those soils back to grow fresh, healthy food at schools. Water quality is always important to remember and talk about. Bioretention and rain garden mixes are you know, compost is like the soup base, and then you add certain sands and certain grades of material together to create soil mixes that go into rain gardens. Rain gardens are essential to water quality. You know, EPA says 70% of water pollution comes from runoff on the roads and driveways. So when you see these rain gardens or bioswales in your neighborhood, they're all filtering out impurities. Approximately 90% of the nutrients are filtered into the plants within the engineered design of that rain garden. And about 80% of your silt is also filtered, so it's not going to navigable waterways. So the more rain gardens we build, the more compost we use, and compost and the mix and the design of those structures, again, is critical to water quality. You can put compost in socks and build retaining walls. Compost is great for erosion control. So here's stacked socks that were put along the side of a sloped area near a parking lot. And they were planted in the fall, and by springtime, they were full of vegetation. And again, filtering things out and also keeping erosion from happening there on that slope. If you're not familiar with Washington Organics Recycling Council Soil for Salmon program, this was really developed to help establish and promote best management practices for putting compost into construction site development. And, you know, large construction sites really require a certain amount of organics go back into the soil. So if you are not familiar with Soil for Salmons, visit their website and take a look at some of the information they have on BNPs for stormwater management, because it's pretty impressive, you know, what's been developed over the years. And here with our sensitive salmon and waterways and the importance of keeping our waterways and our environment clean, you know, compost plays a major role in ensuring that we meet those goals, especially when we're doing large construction projects. This was a ZeroWaste Home in Bellevue that they happened to be blowing compost on a slope in the back several years ago. I think this was 2007. I don't have an after picture, but I love this picture. That was a year we had a 30-year rain. And really what compost does when it comes to slopes is it just knits itself into the side of the hill, and it really holds everything in. So they sprayed this compost on this hillside. They planted materials, it vegetated, they vegetated the hill, and then several months later during the 30-year rain, everything stayed. In other parts of this area, everything sloughed off. So again, there's plenty of slopes in the state of Washington where we can preserve them from erosion by simply using compost to knit into the side and hold everything in the hillside together. So pretty amazing stuff when it comes to erosion control. If you just want to germinate something in a large area, this is a blower truck that was injected with seed, blown out in a tank area of this property. So this was the day they blew the injected seed onto the area they wanted to vegetate, and this was it about 3 weeks later. Again, it has to be the right time of year, but it establishes germination very quickly, and as long as you water it and care for it in the early stages, you will have a wonderful germination. Here's a good example of one of those Soils for Salmons project where a significant amount of compost was used to develop this hillside in Port Blakely and Issaquah. And again, these projects use thousands of yards of compost and, you know, are often spec'd in these projects. And, you know, support your local composter and make sure that we're using local compost to do the projects that are in our own neighborhoods and towns. Bags are another way you can support and use compost if you can't get a bulk truck or you're doing just a container garden. Please look for locally made materials because I know the local composters really count on consumers using their products. But bags are a great way to brand compost out in the marketplace and create brand awareness. So it's an important element in a marketing plan for composters that choose to do bagging. And finally, if any of you are familiar with the Marin Carbon project, there were some studies done years ago, and serendipitously they were working on grazelands, vegetating grazelands. A ranch was looking into, compost use to create vegetation for grazing. And long story short, through this project and applying a lot of compost in arid areas where there wasn't a lot of vegetation, the discovery and the science was determined that, by putting a significant amount of compost out into these large areas, you create a carbon sink, sequesters carbon in the soil, and it has a very positive impact on mitigating climate change. So learn more about that, because that's a big buzzword and a really cool, and when it comes to agriculture and ranching and other applications, carbon farming is a growing initiative that would use a lot more compost if we did more of it. So we have these great compost programs. Compost does wonderful things, but it takes everyone to do it right and do it well. And I like to put the whole sort of concentric community that helps make it happen, including University of Washington. So when we have these programs locally and we keep the material local and we don't ship it off site, we enjoy the benefits both financially and environmentally. We're creating a healthier environment, a stronger economy, and more jobs around compost, like soils and programs that take that compost and create a number of other industries that we get the benefit from. So CMA, how do we fit into that system? Well, we take a models approach to composting. So you've got the regional approach, and then we take that regional model and we lay that into the programs that we set up in all these different cities. So we're doing field testing. We have the lab standard requirement, the field standards, we have paper and wood reviews, and we have lists that we make. But we're also working directly with the composters, and those composters are working directly with municipalities, or they're working directly with haulers, or there's a loop between the three. So we're working with all of them to help educate them on the whole system. And then end users, like University of Washington uses does a lot of composting in food service. I'm going to talk a little bit about a study we did there in a minute. And then consumers, we count on them to help us keep compost clean and develop better programs so there's less confusion about what's compostable and what's not. So we really try and tackle the whole system with our stakeholder groups, and we're continuing to grow our relationships in all these groups so that we're all working together to create a better program. Specifically on field testing, these are just some shots from the work we've done over the last couple of years. I do want to point out the second panel does have an eagle flying over our tester's head. So it was just a lucky shot. But what we do is we have, again, prerequisites for field testing, lab standards that you can learn more about if you send me an email, but they're all here. The other thing that I'm sure you're aware of are the fluorinated chemicals in food service packaging. We have limits on what we accept. We don't accept anything over 100 parts per million total fluorine, and right now we're in the process of contacting everyone that's tested with us and Cedar Grove historically to get their lab results to determine if they meet that level. So it takes a lot of work to get that done, but composters don't want to see fluorinated chemicals in the inputs, so they're banned from coming in for testing at this point in time, and now we're going through and making sure we root out any of the ones that really aren't qualified. So our state, of course, is the first to pass legislation on limiting PFAS in food service packaging. And, and so we've been kind of following along with the state on safe alternatives to what's out there in the market. So what does field testing look like? We basically get samples in, and we visually photograph them, we log them, and then when we go out in the field, we put them in the non-biodegradable bags, 80% feedstock to 20% products, roughly is the mix in the bag. Those bags go into the actual composting processes, and they go through the whole cycle. So for instance, Cedar Grove has 7 to 8 week cycle, but you might have a facility that's an ASP that's a 6 week cycle. So one of the variations between these processes is the duration of that cycle. So, what we're finding is certain materials do better in certain processes and certain materials don't do as well in shorter processes. So this is the first time we've really got a field data that tells us how these products perform in varying processes. And again, the goal is to at least just line the best process with those products that work and make sure the products that don't work really aren't, getting designed or sold to go in processes where they're not going to break down and they'll just be an expense to a composter. After they go through the process, this is the New York facility. They love to come watch us sift the samples, but this is in New York City, Staten Island. And we shipped out the fragments, we bag them and tag them, and we ship them back to beautiful Port Orchard, Washington, where we basically record the results and let the client know and give them a photo report. And anything that doesn't break down, again, back to the model for composting, that's ideal. If it doesn't break down, once it's composted and all the inert materials are screened out, that becomes a contaminant that goes to the landfill. So one of the things we're just trying to deal with is if you sourced a cup or a plate that was, maybe 10 or 15% more in cost because you wanted it to be compostable, only to have it go to the composter and get landfilled, we're just trying to make sure the system works the way it was intended to. And I think a lot of times people don't even know that's the scenario. So we're also trying to educate people that, hey, this material doesn't work, or hey, you keep shipping us these things that aren't on our approved list, but guess what? It doesn't break down and the composter's paying the bill for that. So again, we're trying to take the compost processing manufacturing model and make sure it's revered in this process, but also provide a feedback loop to the customers that really want to do it right, and the distributors and manufacturers that really don't always have that information that it's not working. So we're seeing a lot of companies come to CMA now that want to invest in making sure they know how it works, because ultimately it's going to go on this website. Let's see if that'll open up and I can show you really quick how it works. No. Let's see. So if you go, brand new website, by the way, we just went up April, is that you can go on this site and depending on your process, you can find materials that have worked in that system. The other thing we're doing is various cities that are using our list will have their list here. So the goal again is to give cities and composters a resource on what's accepted in their process by combining the lab standards and the field standards together to ensure that we have the best optimal system available. So that's what we try to do here. By the way, Cedar Grove used to have a list published. That list is no longer active. Cedar Grove is a partner, as I mentioned, so CMA's list is Cedar Grove's list. So when you go to our website, you'll see that there. So that's field testing and what we're really trying to do. I'd just like to highlight some other recent leadership roles that we played. The Sustainable Packaging Coalition conference was out here in April. I believe they also did a lot at the University of Washington when they were here. But Cedar Grove was kind enough to allow tours at the site, and CMA was able to do some demos of our program there with some of the top packaging companies and brands in the country. We also served on the panel there at the West End that they had on PFAS and some of the things that we're working on there. Also want to give a shout out to NatureWorks. They funded a couple of things that have been very helpful in educating clients on optimal systems for composting. One was actually done when I was back at Cedar Grove, and that's the Taco Time one bin system case study. You can go to their website and get a copy of this, but it basically shows how Taco Time went to a one bin system. You might be familiar with this. To make it all compostable other than sort of the kids meal stuff. They have a little tiny black container on the top of the bins. And but they went all compostable, and a lot of folks always say, oh, things are going to cost too much, or they always think about cost. But one of the outcomes of what Taco Time did that's explained in this study is, yes, they had an increase in cost to put in this system, but at the end of the day, their sales grew significantly, and you know, economically, it was a very good move for them. They got a lot of really positive, you know, PR and just a lot of leadership, you know, recognition. And so read the study, read what the bottom line was, because I think you'll be pretty impressed that going with that simple system that worked for their customers, created much cleaner compost, and employed all compostables, to us is the ideal system if we're going to do publicly collected systems. We don't want to have recycling and composting together. We like the one bin systems as composters because you don't get the cross contamination. Finally, because it's University of Washington, we also were funded by NatureWorks to do a waste characterization study to begin to start answering the question, do we get more food scraps when we employ compostables? So this was a part of a two-part project we've been working on with them. But you know, we found out some interesting things that we just wanted to share with you. So we did waste audits in food service areas of the University of Washington only. So this isn't obviously the whole campus, but we found that the profile of landfill material and organics material broke down to be about 80% organics and 20% landfill material. So that the good news is it shows that, you know, real live landfill material is at a minimum at the University of Washington, mostly because of the great leadership of the recycling groups and, you know, other folks and folks that, you know, taken many, many years to, you know, finesse the programs that you have there at the University of Washington. I think the other thing that was interesting, just in terms of not creating trash and not using a bunch of plastics, when you take the food scraps out of the organic stream, the non-food portion was 92% food service packaging, which probably isn't a surprise. But if you think about how much packaging goes to the landfill every day from a large campus, for instance, the size of University of Washington, the fact that that material is going into compost now, and it's bringing food scraps in with it and weight from the liquids within food that goes into the packaging, that's a pretty substantial diversion from landfill. And I also think that's, you know, just a really interesting thing. And the other thing about University of Washington, they take their time to source and do it right. You know, they spend a lot of time asking a lot of questions about a lot of products over a lot of years. So we really appreciate that. And some of the, you know, I think it was Husky Den, and you have the actual visual posters and the videos, and you're just doing some incredible things. So my hats are off to the investment you make in trying to get it right and always improving on it. And finally, just some summary points. You know, what we found in the study is employing all compostables appears to create less contamination because you're not mixing recyclables with compostables. Film plastic is the largest contaminant, or is the largest solid waste component in both the landfill stream as a contaminant in a compost stream. So the more film plastic we can get out, the better. Gloves in any kitchen. It doesn't even, you can go to any kitchen in any part of. Gloves are also a big part of the landfill stream, the plastic gloves used for food service. They can also be an insidious contaminant in composting because they're clear and you can't see them. So, you know, we're seeing more people develop compostable gloves that are an option. And employing the food service packaging appears to support food diversion at a much higher level than not using the compostables. We're still working on other studies, but we began the process to see that in this initial study. And we would like to see film versions of contaminants turned to compostable versions that work under the CMA program in these programs, so that we can keep those composts clean and make sure that we're not putting that burden on the composter. So at the end of the day, CMA works to ensure all of our investments and programs and care that we take to do these programs is protected. In a circular economy model, it means we all work together from start to finish, the way we design, the way we process, the way we manufacture. And I think CMA and the program that we've developed has really allowed us to work much more effectively in a circular economy model. So that is what I have to share with you today, and I'm happy to, follow up with any support to you if you wanted to email me. And with that, I will give the floor back to the team for questions.
Thank you so much, Susan, for your presentation. Now we'll be starting our Q&A session. Thank you to everyone that sent in questions. Reminder, you may use the chat function to send the co-host name Q&A, any direct questions or comments or ideas you have. So first question is, what type of strategies do you recommend to encourage people to close the loop and buy compost products?
Strategies. Like residents, businesses, or anyone?
I guess anybody.
Well, I think some of the things that are done now, like compost days, it's about, I think, a 10-year program that Cedar Grove started, was really a campaign to get people to understand what their food scraps go into. So that marketing, special programs or events are great ways to do it. I'm just pulling from my own experience with them, and some of the work they've done is, where they've had people come and, all you can shovel events of compost. But I think in general, being creative and using social media to promote compost use. I have one of my partners, just pictures of, like the really tall corn, like pictures of mega vegetables and stuff on Facebook get a lot of likes. So I would say right now, using social media to promote, how you're using compost and, making people aware that, you take all this time to make this material, but this is what it actually does. I mean, a lot of times it's let's recycle, but the end of the story is, but let's grow this 8-foot corn stalk, hopefully it'll make it all the way to corn with our weather. But I just think being creative and, really, inspiring people to understand that compost is critical to soil health. And that's what, International Compost Awareness Week is all about.
Is there any way to develop a non-plastic compostable bag for compost and potting soil? Seems contrary to zero waste movement to package in plastic.
That is such a great question, and I wish there were, and I'm not saying there won't be, but here's the challenge. If you make a compostable film for compost, remember compost is active. So the microbes in it will start eating the bag away if it's compostable. So that's the challenge. So I think I'll throw it out to the manufacturing community. If you can make something compostable that can hold compost that's active, and the microbes won't eat it and it won't break all over the shelves at Home Depot, we would love that, because I think all composters agree, it kind of is, a bummer that you have this really thick plastic bag, but it has to hold the compost and it has to keep it from breaking. And so that's the challenge. So.
Do you know of any products that are not yet accepted as compostable by the CMA, but are currently being tested and will be soon?
Well, there's a lot of products on the market that aren't accepted by CMA or may not have passed CMA. Just historically, when I say a lot, I mean, that's what we do. We test them for acceptance. So, yeah, I mean, I guess, are there products being developed that are interesting in the compostable realm? Absolutely. But I can tell you right now that we're under, a lot of these folks developing products or, proprietary information, what they're doing and why. So, we're not at liberty to discuss that, but I will tell you that there's a lot of great development going on in the packaging development industry in compostables. And the great news for us is, in many instances, they're coming to the composters first to make sure they understand how composting works, which is all we're trying to do, is make sure we're included in that consideration. Because it's a big investment to make a compostable product. You have to get a lot of lab testing done. We have fees for what we do, and it's a big investment. So you got to really respect these companies trying to make the right stuff, because they're investing a lot to do it right.
Do you think organic recycling mandates like the one in Seattle are helpful to composting facilities or cause more contamination? Or in other words, are you hopeful to see more organic mandates, or would you like to see a different approach by municipalities?
Well, I feel like I'm not representing a specific composter, so I don't want to answer that on behalf of any other composter. I personally, around the country, I think mandates are important to, if you can't get participation. So a lot of it's going to depend on the culture of the community. You know, some communities are going to like do it because, you know, that's just what they do, and other communities won't. So I think if you can't move the dial to get people to do organics recycling, then I do think mandates are important.
How do we get involved with CMA? I'm concerned that compostable plastics, which are composed of small plastic polymers linked by biodegradable bonds, simply hasten the decomposition of these materials to micro and nano scale plastic waste.
Well, the lab standards are to ensure that's not the case. So if you're talking about a plastic that would just fragment into thousands of pieces, which is an oxo-biodegradable, they won't even be considered at CMA or at BPI unless they meet a specific lab standard that tells us it will break down in nature to biomass and water. So that's already covered by the ASTM standards and the BPI certification. And if they don't meet that, we're not interested because we're with you on that. If you have materials that don't meet the ASTM standards, we're not going to do a visual disintegration test in a compost pile because we don't know if we can't see that fragment in the soil. We don't know that it wouldn't leave something behind we can't even see. So we absolutely understand that question, but know that the steps are taken through those lab standards to ensure that we're not getting polymers that are not designed to compost into biomass and water into our system.
When do you think you will have a compost partnership down in California?
Well, we're talking to composters now. And the thing about CMA, we're free and we're open to all composters, and we actually, anyone can be an affiliate that's a composter that does over 20,000 tons a year of composting. So I'm actually talking to some Southern California composters, Northern California composters, and I'm hopeful that we'll have some systems and testing set up, you know, within the next 6 months down in California. So we're hopeful to be down there soon.
I see a lot of ads for new Glad bags that are flower scented and are green, but are not compostable. Is CMA involved in any legal initiatives to stop manufacturers from creating products like this?
That is an excellent question. And okay, like Glad bin liners or Glad like Ziploc?
I'm assuming bin liners.
Okay, well, you know, the state has a first compostable labeling legislation now, Washington State. In fact, we just had a working group collaborate with the U.S. Composting Council on the legislation that's coming into effect in July. So we are taking legislation now and doing exactly that, starting to deal with it at a legislative level. For instance, this doesn't really cover what you're putting on the shelf, but maybe it does. If it's a bin liner, you can't sell something that's not compostable, and it can't be green or brown. So if you want a copy of that legislation, that's already starting. And again, Washington State was the first to come up with this labeling legislation. I want to give a shout out to the people at the Washington Organics Recycling Council legislative group that worked on that. Jay Blasey at Cedar Grove, Michelle Riggs, Sago Jackson, City of Seattle, Heather Trim, ZeroWaste Washington, and any of the stakeholders that were involved with that. So,
are there any more chains on the horizon that might adopt Taco Time's single compost only bin strategy?
not that I'm aware of, but I'm hopeful. I think part of our challenge is, you know, we kind of have this niche that we do, and there's 50,000 projects I'd like to do to work on that, but we just don't have the bandwidth yet. We're still a bit of a startup. But I would love to see, I was just on the phone with, someone this morning about an upstream leadership group that could begin to tackle, you know, BMPs for big brands. And so I'm hoping that's going to develop through the U.S. Composting Council, because I think that's definitely the next frontier. You know, we can pull this stuff out all day at the end of it, but why don't we go upstream and make sure it never starts? So that's why this legislation is important. That's why these higher level initiatives to, I mean, I just think there's not enough of a feedback loop. I think people don't understand. There might be 1,000 people between the sustainability director of a big corporation and the person that bought the cups, you know, 20 levels back. So we got to get way upstream to the leadership group and show them where the breakdowns are in these systems so we can make sure we're developing good systems again together. If the end point is compost facilities, we got to get composters to tell the story. And we need everyone's help to do that because they can't do it by themselves. They're too busy making compost.
Back in regards to the plastic compost bag question, what about having bulk compost products available for purchase by consumers at retail outlets that we could bring our own containers to pick up?
I think that's a great strategy. Again, I don't own a composting facility, but I think that's a great strategy. I think some facilities are probably set up to do that really well. Years and years ago, I worked with Home Depot, and when I was with Cedar Grove on a bulk program where it actually was a delivery program, so it wasn't a pickup program. But I think those are models that could work. I know the other thing composters will do is, you know, if you have a facility that's 30 miles away, you know, driving a truck 30 miles away to get compost kind of defeats the purpose, right? But a lot of them are setting up soil yards around neighborhoods. So what you might want to consider doing is looking, like if you know, if you have Cedar Grove and it's available through this soil yard over here, you know, you can get it a lot of times in smaller loads, or potentially a soil yard would provide that compost to you in a smaller load. But I think that's a great idea, and I just think reach out to your local composters and soil yards and tell them that's a program that you want. They will respond. I just think sometimes they don't know that, you know, that would be a, you know, a preference for somebody.
What is the incentive for industrial composters to accept biodegradable plastic waste, given the byproducts are primarily carbon dioxide and water vapor, and the biomass that remains is only a small fraction of the residue, parentheses, less than 3%?
It's about being a carrier for food. So if I have a biodegradable bag, it's not the bag. That's not what you're right. There's no value added in the bag itself, really. But if it's full of your leftover, you know, taco shells and, you know, old lettuce from your, you know, crisper drawer, hopefully without the plastic, then, you know, then it's bringing in a lot of food. So that's really the driver for compost facilities. To take packaging is not the value of the packaging. It's that it carries in food.
What impact on the composting industry do you expect / are you preparing for, given that NYC has announced that they will be halting their curbside organics collection due to COVID-related cuts?
Well, in terms of the composting industry, I mean, I think like every other industry right now, it's really hard to tell what that means. You know, I personally, you know, for now, it's probably definitely a mitigating, you know, strategy, but I think it doesn't mean it, I don't believe it means it's over. So again, there's a lot of compost facilities operating all over the country, and there will be areas, you know, where they're going to make those decisions. But like everything else, I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know if that means that we're a year away from hearing that they're back on track, or 2 years or 10 years. It's just hard to say, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Starbucks cups sold at UW are compostable, but not the cups they use at their other retail outlets. Are you aware of any initiatives within Starbucks to make all their cups compostable?
I am not aware of any initiatives. I've interfaced with Starbucks over many years in various capacities, and would just encourage you to reach out to them and, you know, get some updates. They have great people there, and get some updates on anything they might be working on.
What happens when fluorine ends up in compost?
Well, fluorine's sort of the precursor to PFAS, which is the PFOAs and PFOSs, which I won't be able to pronounce that correctly, but the fluorinated chemicals of concern. You know, I think the issue is, you know, those materials are persistent and they bioaccumulate. So there's very, very low levels in packaging and very, very low levels in compost. And we don't want people to be concerned about compost right now because the benefits of compost far outweigh the concern. But that's why we want to stop it now from coming in the future. But if that fluorine, if there's PFAS in that fluorinated chemical range within compost, you know, you just need to read about PFAS and the concerns about it. In anything, it's in carpet and water and food. I mean, unfortunately, it's a big topic that it's everywhere. So composting is one area where, you know, we're going to limit it by having standards for fluorine. But we just don't want it. We just don't want it to be an element in the compost because it bioaccumulates over time, and you know, it's just not something we would want in compost or anything. So, but it's a universal problem. And the U.S. Composting Council is doing a whole lot of work on that, in addition to, like, again, BPI and some of the other groups. ASTM is coming up with a standard for it as well to be tested. But it's just, it's like, you know, you don't want certain things in that come back to soil and compost.
Is the composting industry growing? What is the outlook, and what can we do to bring industrial composting into our communities / municipality?
Well, back to the policy driven, you know, there's two things that I think are factors. Again, the policies. Are you going to meetings with your solid waste planners and talking about composting? Is the economic model right? I mean, unfortunately, the reality is if you have really low landfill rates and composting, so if landfill rates are $15 a ton and it would cost $30 to compost, it doesn't pencil. So these are programs that take a while to get all those drivers going. But I've seen community composters. You know, first time I went to New York City at the first food waste fair, I was just so impressed with young people building these little community compost facilities in the middle of New York City. So there's either the sheer will of putting something together on your own, or going to your local municipalities and haulers and saying, hey, how can I be part of, you know, your solid waste advisory councils? If you can be the, you know, resident member, you know, that advises on, you know, wanting composting, but it's really getting to know your solid waste folks, going to the Washington State Recycling Association conferences and asking certain cities, like, how do I make this happen? But it takes a lot of money, time, and the drivers have to be there to really make it happen. But, you know, I've seen a lot of incredible people do some pretty incredible things.
So how small can an industrial composting site be and still be profitable?
That I really can't answer. I've really only worked for really big ones. But it's just like any other business model. You know, if you price out a loader and labor and land and, you know, figure out what your fee has to be for the inbound and your price for the compost outbound, it's really up to the, you know, it's up to building the model that works. So you have to have all those elements figured out, and then make sure you have the right permits. If you're going to take, you know, usually you can't take more than yard waste or vegetative, you know, I'm talking about landscape vegetation in a small facility, because you need a whole lot more to deal with pathogens and stuff when you get in food. But if you can figure out land, equipment, and labor, you could probably cost out whether or not you're going to have any customers, what it's going to take to market it. It's just like any other business model. I can't really answer that without, those factors being considered.
Mhm. Are composting facilities able to sell greenhouse gas offsets because they have such an impact on methane gas emissions?
That's an excellent question. I'm not an expert on that. I have heard of facilities that, could sell off the carbon credits, but I'm not an expert on that. I'm not really sure who you could go to find out about it, but I've heard that has been done, and that's a really great point. It does offset a lot of the costs that they can get those paid for those credits.
Mhm. Does CMA work to help vendors when there's an item that is CMA approved for composting, but it looks similar to lots of non-compostable items? For example, white utensils can be compostable, but the vendor is concerned about removing non-compostable plastic contamination, so they may not accept any white utensils.
Okay, well, so that's kind of done on a facility by facility basis. So one of the initiatives CMA's been working on is, at least for large events, the color marking system for a suite of products. So we're trying to promote the importance of color marking, distinguishing products. And you'll hear a lot of composters say, turn it purple, turn it orange, turn it anything but what everything else looks like. So our whole industry is asking for a solution, and it can't just be a logo from 20 feet up on a loader. It's got to be distinguishable. In fact, part of the legislation in Washington is to create what's distinguishable. And part of our conversation this week was, we need manufacturers to tell us, what can you do? But for instance, Cedar Grove had mentioned for certain instances, that they only take brown, on a certain cutlery, or they only take a brown cutlery. So because they can't tell the difference between the black and the white, and so yeah, I'd say color marking, distinguishing things. It's a problem we all have to solve. I don't have the solution, but I know that those are some ideas, but we really want the industry to help us figure that out. That's really important and a really good question.
All right, we are almost running out of time. We could maybe hit one more question. Has there been any movement towards making produce labels compostable?
Yes, yes. I know that there's a approved label through apparently Elevate Packaging is approved label maker. But again, selling that and getting upstream that it actually goes on the piece of fruit, I think that's a complex challenge. But 5 years ago, I was screaming for a compostable produce label. They're available now, but now you go upstream to actually implement that. And that's not what I'm an expert at. And I'm just hopeful that some of the folks that are really working on solving that problem for us will be successful, or maybe they are, and I just haven't gotten any updates.
Mhm. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us from all of us of UW Recycling. Thank you for joining our discussion today. Thank you so much, Susan Thoman, for joining us. Check out UW Recycling's Facebook and Instagram for future events and resources. We hope you had a thoughtful and active celebration of International Compost Awareness Week.
Thank you.
Thank you.